All right. Well, it is 7:05, so I guess I will get started here. Although we do still have people joining, so I may have to be going back and forth between the program and my screen here for a couple of minutes. But to everyone who is just joining us now, I want to welcome you all to the program tonight, Wayzata and the Modern Movement. And I would like to remind you all to please mute your microphones if you have not done so already, because that will help us immensely with preventing feedback. Also, if you have any questions, we can take them by using the chat feature, which is up in the top right corner of your screen. So if you type in a question, we have our friend Joni Holst here, who will be writing the questions down, and we can answer them for you at the end. But I guess I will begin with some thank yous here. And I'd like to start just by thanking some of the folks who have helped me do some of the research for this project and who have talked with me about some of the buildings and houses and properties that I'll be discussing tonight. So I'd like to thank Betty Hamill, Philip Pillsbury, Judson Dayton, Bobak Hayeri, and also I want to thank the photographers and the people who have lent me photos to be used in the program tonight. And I also want to thank Joni Holst, one of our board members here at the Wayzata Historical Society. She's sitting right across from me, actually, and she will be helping me run the show tonight. And again, another reminder to please mute your microphones if you have not done so already. And please use the chat feature for questions. Welcome to the program tonight. My name is Aaron Person, by the way. I am the president of the Wayzata Historical Society. But my background is kind of in urban planning and architecture, so this is a topic that is close and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to be sharing this with you tonight. So I want to begin with a very basic question, and that's basically how to define what modern is. And according to Docomomo, which is a group that preserves, the mission is to preserve the modern movement, modern means that a building or a structure looks forward to the future without overt reference to historical precedent. It also expresses functional, technical, or spatial properties rather than reliance on decoration or ornamentation. And it's self-conscious about itself, so it purposely strives to express those two principles that I just described above. So it actively tries to be futuristic or forward-looking. So these here are some of the examples of buildings that were popular, the styles that were popular in the late 1800s. These are all local examples, but I think they're good examples. And the styles in America in the late 1800s were very much looking to history for inspiration. And you can see the Burwell House there on the left takes inspiration from the Italian villas. Minneapolis City Hall in the middle, that's looking back to the Renaissance, also Italian. And the Camp Memorial Chapel, or St. Martin's Church on the right, is looking back to the colonial America time period. All of these buildings have, as you can see, kind of a relatively strong vertical emphasis in their lines and proportions. And they have a lot of applied ornamentation, a lot of the spindly-looking woodwork and that sort of thing, or stonework for Minneapolis City Hall. And as I said earlier, they definitely look to the past for inspiration. But then, in 1892, the architect of Minneapolis City Hall, Franklin Long, he built a summer cottage for himself out here in Wayzata in Arlington Heights, kind of near the site where Mary Ellen Gee's house is today, if you know where that is. But this curiosity of a summer cottage was built in Arlington Heights by Frank Long as his personal summer cabin in 1892. Now, this thing looks like it could have been built 50 years ahead of its time, as the ribbon windows and the boxy form of the house, as well as the unusual fenestration, the ovals up at the top. To use a word that's kind of a buzzword right now, This house was essentially just unprecedented for the time, and I really have no idea where he was getting his inspiration from. So in the late 1800s, there were some massive and important changes in technology that were happening that really changed the direction that architecture was going. In 1888, a Minneapolis architect named Leroy Buffington received a patent for the iron frame skyscraper construction method that you can see. That's the Flatiron Building in New York on the right, and it used basically that same method. Now, Leroy Buffington, he was based in Minneapolis, but he did design out here on Lake Minnetonka. He designed all three of the big hotels that were on the lake. That would be the Lafayette, the Lake Park, and the Hotel St. Louis. And he also designed the buildings out at Big Island Park later on in 1906. Then, about 12 years later, a man named Charles Hagelin, who was another Minneapolis architect, was commissioned by a Wayzatan named Frank Peavy to engineer the world's first concrete grain elevator, which was located in St. Louis Park. And Charles Hagelin also received the first patent for pre-stressed concrete, and also the slip-form pour method that we use for concrete. Still, even today, we use that. That's when you pour concrete and let it cure, and then pour another layer on top of it, etc. And Charles Hagelin, I should mention, had a cabin on Big Island that we talked about in the previous program on West Big Island back in November. His son, Charles Hagelin Jr., also owned Breezy Point over here in the Woodland, Wayzata area, and he built the house there that still stands on Breezy Point today. And then finally, in 1913, another very famous Minnesota architect, Cass Gilbert, he designed the world's first super skyscraper. That was the Woolworth Building in New York. And that really was a game changer for architecture in the United States. And it used both the concrete and steel frame methods that I just described above. So here on the left is a rendering or a drawing of Leroy Buffington's skyscraper concept. And that's what he received his patent for. In the middle, that is the Peavy Hagelin Experimental Concrete Grain Elevator. That is the first concrete grain elevator in the world. And we know it today as the Nordic Ware Tower in St. Louis Park. I know it doesn't look like much, but this was an immensely important structure, as it has been replicated all over the world in many, many places. And this is indeed a National Historic Landmark. And then on the right here that is the Woolworth Building in New York that Cass Gilbert designed, and that was the world's first super skyscraper that was hundreds of feet tall. So in the late 1800s, with these tall buildings, the question arose of how you would design tall buildings. And since nothing like them had been done before, they had to come up with some new principles. So this man named Louis Sullivan, he was an architect from Chicago who led a group of architects called the Chicago School, came up with this quote that says, "A tall building must be every inch a proud and soaring thing, rising in sheer exaltation so that from bottom to top it should be a unit without a single dissenting line." Okay, so we're getting a little bit away from ornamentation there, as was popular in those times. So here's Louis Sullivan. Two of the people in the Chicago School of Architects, the ring that he led, were a young Frank Lloyd Wright on the left, bottom left there. And on the bottom right is another architect named William Purcell. And, George Elmsley. His partner was William Purcell. But these are the buildings that the Chicago School was known for on the right. And as you can see, this style made that the buildings were very composed of three parts, with a bottom street level and a big middle section, and then a top section that is a little bit more ornamented. So the younger generation that Louis Sullivan trained in and that he taught included Frank Lloyd Wright and George Elmsley here. And they ended up, when they came of age, they started their own school of architectural thought called the Prairie School. And that was basically led by Frank Lloyd Wright. But this generation of architects, mainly based in Chicago, was repulsed by the historical architecture of the day. They thought that all of these historical European styles were essentially dishonest, and they set out to create a new, purely American style that would reflect the prairie, the flat lines and the long lines of the American prairie of the Midwest. And they called it the prairie style because of that. And the prairie style, these are two famous examples on the right, but you can see very long, low hipped roof, and just a very extremely apparent horizontal emphasis. Now here's George Elmsley and William Purcell. George Elmsley was a colleague of Frank Lloyd Wright earlier on in the day. But in 1907, he came up to Minnesota and reestablished himself and partnered with William Purcell, who was on the right there. And in 1913, the firm of Purcell and Elmsley designed a house for Edward Decker off of Bushway Road. But this was a very prairie school style house. And this firm of Purcell and Elmsley was actually the second biggest prairie school style firm after Frank Lloyd Wright. So here's the Decker House. This is located on the east side of Bushway Road in Wayzata. And the main house on the left there was actually demolished in 1944. But the part of the house on the right, which is a service wing, still remains today. And here are some other photos of this house. I'll just go through them here. Very just classic prairie school style house here. This would have been built in 1913, and as you can imagine, this type of style would have been fairly modern for that day, because a lot of the arts and crafts and the historical styles were still the predominant form of architecture that was still popular at that time. So that was the Decker House. And then 1 year later, down in Deep Haven, Frank Lloyd Wright himself came up to Minnesota to design a house for a couple named Francis and Mary Little. And Francis Little was a lawyer in the Chicago area, actually lived in the same area as Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicagoland, and they were basically in the same social circle. So that's perhaps one of the reasons that Frank Lloyd Wright was hired to design this house. This house was located in the North Home neighborhood of Deep Haven, and was the largest prairie school style house that Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed in Minnesota. It was approximately 200 feet long. It actually merged two hills together, as you can see in this photo, and it incorporated about 300 windows from end to end. And a lot of them were stained glass, although less of them were stained glass than originally planned. But the Littles, especially Mrs. Little, wanted to be able to see Lake Minnetonka, and with too much stained glass, she wouldn't have been able to see the lake. So if she got her way a little bit, they compromised. So here's a view looking up the road. You can see Robinson's Bay is in the background there behind the trees. This is on Robinson's Bay. So the Little House was demolished in 1972, unfortunately, because the Littles, they had originally intended for it to just be a summer home, but ended up living at the house year-round because they liked it up here in Minnesota and being on Lake Minnetonka year-round. But with 300 windows like that, you can imagine it would get pretty cold during the winter, and it was very expensive to heat. So it was just deemed to be impractical, and there were some issues with the zoning codes that wouldn't allow them to build a second house on the property. So it was ultimately demolished in 1972. However, some of the rooms were nicely dismantled and then reassembled in art museums across the country. Most famously at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and also at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in Minneapolis. So this is at the MIA in Minneapolis, or MIA as it's called now. And this is a hallway from the little house that has been reassembled there. It's right out in the main area. You can go visit it today. You can see they kind of tried to recreate the look of Robinson's Bay there, which was the view that the little house would have had as it existed in Deep Haven. This is the library of the little house, and I believe this ended up, I want to say this ended up in Pittsburgh, at a museum in Pittsburgh. But this is perhaps the most famous room of the house. This was the Great Music Room. And this room was dismantled and then reassembled at the Met Museum in New York, which can still be visited today. Maybe not during COVID, but during normal times, you'd be able to walk inside of this room and experience it as it would have been. Now, with the styling here, I mentioned that the Prairie style was a uniquely American style, which it was. It was the first uniquely American style that there was, for the most part. Frank Lloyd Wright would say that all of this came right out of his head, but there really was probably, it appears to be a lot of influence from both Japanese and Native American architecture that was interwoven with his own taste. So it was kind of an amalgamation of a lot of those influences. And then finally here, this is the view that the little house would have had looking over Robinson's Bay. If you look real closely out here, you can see Wayzata, downtown Wayzata, and you can even see the water tower in the back of that picture. And then this happened. Frank Lloyd Wright was arrested on Lake Minnetonka in 1926, so this would have been long after the little house was built. But the story behind this was that he came up to Minnesota with his mistress, Olga Hinsenberg, in 1926, and both of them were married to others at the time. So Frank Lloyd Wright's wife sent the authorities up to go retrieve her husband, but she filed a false claim saying that he was violating the Mann Act, which basically meant that she was basically saying that he was using Olga Hinsenberg for prostitution purposes, which was totally untrue. But nevertheless, they were arrested on the shores of Lake Minnetonka in 1926 and did spend a couple of nights in the Hennepin County Jail. But the charges were dropped after the charges were found to be totally untrue. Both Wright and Hinsenberg ended up divorcing their respective spouses and then ended up marrying each other in 1928. So this story did have a happy ending in the end. So I've been talking about the United States here, but what was happening in Europe during this time? There were a lot of ideas going back and forth between the United States and Europe, so even though it's thousands of miles away, it still had an impact here in Wayzata. In the 1890s, a style called Art Nouveau was very popular in France and Belgium and Austria and some other places in Europe as well. Art Nouveau is, if I can describe it, is very much very floral, very using design with plants in mind. Kind of think plants and vines and flowers, but all cast in metal, and that would be Art Nouveau. Then in 1913, an architect named Adolf Loos, if I'm pronouncing that right, he was a Vienna architect where Art Nouveau was rather popular. It was called the Viennese Succession in Vienna, though. But he was repulsed by Art Nouveau and the other historical styles that were popular at that time. And in 1913, he published an essay and a lecture called Ornament and Crime, where he basically lambasted the applied ornament that was being used all over the place during those times. Then in 1914, World War I began in Europe, and that ended up spurring the Surrealist movement. So that included people like, in the art world, included people like Picasso and Salvador Dali, people like that. caused a lot of disillusionment among a younger generation. And their thought was that the old world, the old ways had basically failed them. So they were going to set out to change the world basically with a new art and new style and new architecture. Then in 1919, a architecture and design school called the Bauhaus was established in Germany. This was a very influential architecture school or design school, and they designed everything from buildings, but they also designed furniture and chairs and everything from that all the way down to tea kettles. So they really designed everything, and were looking at the world at every object that was produced could be designed and could be made beautiful, but also done in an industrial way to promote efficiency. And then in 1923, an architect who is now quite famous, his name is Le Corbusier, which was a fake name, but that's what he went by. And he published a revolutionary book called Towards a New Architecture. The cover of it is located on the right of the screen here. And this book was very revolutionary for its time, and it basically became a Bible for the modern architects who were coming of age during this time period. So this is a quote from Adolf Loos from Vienna when he's lambasting the ornament that was being used in architecture all over the place in 1913. And he said, "The evolution of culture marches with the elimination of ornament from useful objects. Freedom from ornament is a sign of spiritual strength." However, there was also, I should mention, a racial element to Adolf Loos's philosophy here by using groups like Pacific Islanders using tattoos as prohibiting them from evolving as a society or as a people. But nevertheless, this thought about ornament was becoming more and more mainstream, and that ornament was becoming less and less attractive to the younger generations. And then this is a quote from Le Corbusier from the book Towards a New Architecture. And in that book, he said, "Cubes, cones, spheres, cylinders, or pyramids are the great primary forms which light reveals to the advantage. The image of these is distinct and tangible within us, and without ambiguity. It is for a reason that these are the most beautiful forms, the most beautiful forms." And I think it's worth mentioning that the chapter that this quote is from in this book was illustrated exclusively with concrete grain elevators that were in the Midwest, which Charles Hagelund invented, a local man. And that book, as I said earlier, did become kind of a Bible for the modernist movement, so that's quite remarkable for the impact that our very own Charles Hagelund had there. So another thing going on in Europe during this time was the Art Deco movement. And this was a little bit different because it was less industrial, but it was modernism, but in a more artistic way. And in 1901, in France, the Society of Decorative Artists was founded. Now, after several delays and a world war, this society held the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts, and that was in 1925. And this exposition, which was held in Paris, was meant to showcase products that are artistic in character and show clearly modern tendencies. So a little bit different from the heavy-handed industrial ornament and crime type of philosophy. And then in 1828, with the construction of the Chrysler Building in New York, Art Deco became all the rage in the United States. The United States actually sent an official envoy to the Art Deco exposition and brought back some ideas. And really in the late 1920s, Art Deco really took off in the United States. So here are some Art Deco icons, all famous Art Deco skyscrapers here. That's the Chrysler Building in New York on the left. We have our very own Fauché Tower in the middle there. That's in Minneapolis, built in 1929. Then on the right, of course, is the Empire State Building. Locally here in Wayzata, our theater marquee, which was, well, the theater was built in 1932. I think the marquee was built around the same time. But this is very Art Deco in nature. And Art Deco is all about the lines and the geometric shapes, as you can see there. I should also mention that the marquee in Wayzata is a replica, the one that exists today. The original one was actually located about half a block west of the current marquee, but the design is true to its form. So then we have this guy, Rufus Rand Jr., who was Wayzata's very first mayor when the city incorporated in 1929. Now, in 1929, the same year that he became Wayzata's mayor, he also built this building, the Rand Tower, in downtown Minneapolis. I think it's at like Marquette and 6th in downtown or close to that area. And this has been called by an architectural historian who shall remain unnamed. It has been called the sexiest example of Art Deco in Minnesota. And it was built as the headquarters for the Minigasco Company, which Rufus Rand was also the president of, and it also held offices for other companies as well. Now, Rufus Rand, a little background on him, was that he had served as a fighter pilot in World War I, and when he became the first mayor of Wayzata in 1929, he served for a term of 2 years, I believe. And during his short tenure as our mayor, he got Lake Street paved and the sewer systems were installed. We also got our public beach. Now, I mentioned that Rand was a fighter pilot in World War I. He was also a pilot in World War II later on as well. But this building was designed very much with aviation in mind, and it was really just a total celebration of aviation, which was a very new and popular and exciting thing in 1929. The building was designed by a firm called Halliburton and Root, which was based in Chicago, but it was constructed by the company of C.F. Hagelin and Sons. So that would have been Charles Hagelin Jr., who owned the house and built the house on Breezy Point that still stands there today. So his firm built the building. And another interesting tidbit about the Rand Tower is that Leroy Buffington, the old skyscraper guy who filed the first patent for the steel frame skyscraper for Minneapolis, received his first and only royalty for the construction of the Rand Tower. Rufus Rand must have known him personally, and Buffington was kind of down and out on his luck, so it is said that Rufus Rand felt bad for Leroy Buffington and paid him a royalty kind of out of pittance for it. But that was the right thing to do. So here's the interior of the Rand Tower as it looks today. This is actually a recent photo, looking down the elevator lobby. Now, at the end of this hallway, you can see a sculpture down here, and this sculpture is called Wings, again with aviation in mind. And this wing sculpture was designed by a sculptor named Oscar Hansen, who is best remembered for designing these sculptures at the Hoover Dam in Nevada/Arizona. And it's a really neat sculpture. Here's a close-up of it. And on the left here's Rufus Rand during World War I in France. And I find it curious, the resemblance of the lines of the propeller blade and the arms of the sculpture. They're very similar. So here's a different angle from, this is the main lobby of the Rand Tower. And Wings is off on the left side, as you can see there. Here's the staircase that goes up and down. And then the Rand Tower was just recently converted into the Rand Tower Hotel. It just opened as a hotel about a month ago or 2 months ago. And they did a phenomenal job on redoing it. But I appreciate the Wi-Fi password that they have. As you can see, the Wi-Fi password is Rufus, after Rufus Rand. it's a nice way to honor his legacy. In the 1930s, then, modernism really became mainstream. The Great Depression had hit in 1929. That's when the stock market crashed. Then in 1932, a art curator who turned into an architect named Philip Johnston curated an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called the International Style. Now, this exhibit was basically a showcase of modern design, and he called it the International Style. And this was the first time that modernism had really received an actual name. Before that, it didn't really have a name, and it wasn't really regarded as a style. It was more of a social movement before. Then in 1933, the Century of Progress exhibition, also known as the Chicago World's Fair, was held in Chicago. And this was also another showcase of modern design and showcased the most recent and latest technologies in construction methods. And then in 1935, in the depths of the Great Depression, the WPA, or Works Progress Administration, changed names right in the middle there to something else as well, but it was always the WPA. And it incorporated elements of both Art Deco and also an offshoot of Art Deco called Streamline Moderne. And some buildings from that program were also done in the stripped classical style, so more of a classical bent, but in a modern way. So this is Philip Johnston on the left, and he is the one who curated the International Style exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 1932. It's just a picture of what the exhibit looked like. Also was a book, and the cover of that is in the middle there. So these are the houses that were at the Century of Progress exhibition at the Chicago's World Fair in 1933. And on the left, that's called the House of Tomorrow, and it had a hangar for a portable airplane because it was thought that people would be commuting to work by air at some point in the future, but alas, that never happened. All of these homes, each showcasing different construction methods and styles, were preserved after the end of the exposition, and they were moved across Lake Michigan to Indiana, and they actually still exist at Indiana Dunes National Park, so you can go visit them today. I highly recommend that. In our Wayzata area, probably the most significant structure from this time period is located over in Woodland on the south side of Wayzata Bay. And this house was built by Fred Nash, who was a member of the Nash family and was a prominent book and art dealer. Now, he hired an architect named William Lescaz, or Lacaz, who is pictured on the left there. And William Lacaz is credited with designing the first international-style skyscraper in the world in Philadelphia back in 1932. So he is a very important architect, globally speaking. And this house he designed in Woodland in 1937, the Nash House, and incorporated elements of both international and a little bit of streamlined modern styles as well. And of course, we have the Wayzata Post Office here. This building was built by the WPA in 1941, kind of towards the end of the program. But this was very much done in the stripped classical style. So it's kind of a neo-colonial building, but in a stripped and somewhat modern way. So this was a typical example of a Class D post office designed by Louis Simon. And as I said, very stripped classical. This was designed right at the end of when this style was used, because after World War II started, stripped classical really went out of fashion because the Nazis really went crazy with stripped classical, and the rest of the world was kind of turned off by it because of that. On the inside of the post office, there's a very interesting mural up on the wall if you look up on the south side next time you go in there. And this mural is called Pines of the North. And it was painted by a WPA artist named Ruth Grottenrath. And she was a WPA artist from Milwaukee who did some other murals in other post offices as well. So, since this is right around before and during World War II, so we have to go back to Europe because there was a lot of stuff happening over there during this time period. So I was talking earlier about the Bauhaus School in Germany, and that was the influential design school in Dessau, Germany. And in the 1920s, the Bauhaus was already experimenting with a type of building called the box, which is what it sounds like, the boxy style of architecture that we think of when we think of modern architecture. They were kind of the first to experiment with that, continuing with industrial design innovations. Up to the north in Scandinavia, an architect named Alvar Aalto was leading a group of architects called the Northern Modernists, and they were taking into account a lot of the Bauhaus type of design principles, but they were basically doing boxy things and whatnot. But instead of using glass and steel and concrete, they were using a lot of wood. Keep that in mind because that will come back later. And then in 1933, the Nazis seized power in Germany, and immediately, or soon after that, the Bauhaus School was shut down. And it was shut down because Hitler and the Nazis declared everyone at the Bauhaus communists, so they were forced to shut down, and the Nazis took over the campus. They actually considered destroying it, but ended up not doing that. But nevertheless, this ended up leading to an exodus of architects from the Bauhaus to the United States. So what was their loss was our gain during that time period. And then finally, in 1939, World War II began. That lasted until 1945. So one of the architects to leave Europe during this time was Elizabeth or Liesl Schuh. She later married a man named Winston Close, and her name became Elizabeth Close after that. But Liesl Close, or Schuh, grew up in Vienna, Austria. She grew up in a house designed by Adolf Loos, who I talked about earlier. He was the ornament and crime guy, who kind of was one of the earliest modern architects out there. And growing up in a house designed by Loos inspired Liesl Close to become an architect, which was very rare for women at this time. In 1932, she left Austria, left Europe, and came to the United States due to the rising anti-Semitism in Europe during that time. And she was half Jewish. Her mother was Jewish. So she kind of got out of there just in the nick of time. And came to, I believe she went to school at MIT, but then ended up coming to Minnesota with her eventual husband, Winston Close. Now, as a woman in architecture at that time, she faced some pretty extreme sexism in that field during that time. Of the firms that she applied for, many of them basically they refused to hire her because they thought that she would be a distraction in the workplace and whatnot. That was a very common thought process during those times. But on the more extreme end, one of the firms she applied for said that she would have to pay them to work for them for the honor of working for them. Let that sink in for a minute. But nevertheless, she did end up finding employment here in the Twin Cities and ended up being very successful, her and her husband both. And they ended up forming their own architectural firm called Close Associates. And they designed buildings all over Minnesota, including a few in the Lake Minnetonka and Wayzata areas, which I've pictured here over on the right side. So on the top, this is the Gray Freshwater Institute out in Navarre, and this was designed by Liesl Close. Down on the bottom left is the Duff House, which was in Woodland, but unfortunately that was demolished about 10 years ago. On the bottom right, then, that is the Wallace Dayton House over on West Ferndale. And this house still exists today, but it was recently renovated pretty substantially. So the form has basically it looks very different now. Now, another one of the Europeans who escaped from the Nazis and came to the United States was Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was a Bauhaus architect. He ended up resettling in Chicago, and probably his most influential quote is that less is more. God is in the detail. And that really became the mantra for modern American architecture during the post-World War II era. So in the United States, after World War II, there were some big changes that happened, obviously. In 1949, President Harry Truman announced the Fair Deal, which basically funneled a lot of money into federal assistance for housing and for education, which led to just a massive building boom. Many homes, many housing units and single-family homes, many schools, many college campuses, a lot of redesigns, and a lot of urban renewal projects as well. And all of this called for new buildings to be built, and they needed to be built quickly and cheaply. So in the 1950s, architecture became much more boxy because of this, because it was cheap and efficient to build. And these boxy buildings utilized industrial materials, so there's a lot more steel and glass and brick that was incorporated into buildings during this period, unlike the earlier periods where there was a lot more customization before. Then in 1956, the Interstate Highway Act was signed into law by Eisenhower, and this led to further mass suburbanization of our metropolitan areas, and that led to even more construction, more single-family homes, more schools, and more everything else that goes along with that. So remember this guy, Philip Johnson. He was the curator of the International Style exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art back in 1932. So he basically was the first guy to recognize modernism as a style. In 1954, he designed a house out in Orono, off of Shoreline, County Road 15, let's say, out in Orono. And this house was designed for Richard Davis, who was the director of the MIA in Minneapolis. This house was built in 1954 and was done very much in the style of the Van der Rohe style, or the Miesian style, the whole less is more concept. And Johnson and Van der Rohe were actually close friends, and Philip Johnson really admired him. So this is the interior of the Davis house. And note the central courtyard with live plants and sunroof in the middle there. It also had, I believe it's a marble floor or some kind of natural material. Again, very much done in the less is more, God is in the detail philosophy. And this is what it looked like in more recent times. This is still, I think, basically what it looks like today. Over in Minnetonka now, down just south of Wayzata, a local architect, this is a local guy named Donald Hustad, built and designed and built his own personal house for his family. And this house would have been located, or is located, right behind where Snuffy's Malt Shop is, kind of right in that area. Now, this house was built in 1958, and shortly after construction was finished, it was featured in Life magazine and actually got a several-page spread devoted to it, and it was considered a model modern house for that time period. It was also noted for its barrel-vaulted ceiling, as you can see. That was kind of a unique touch at that time. Here's some photos from that Life magazine spread of the inside of the house. And look, they had a television set. That's a new thing that we haven't seen yet. Some more photos here. So this is kind of a big deal for a local house like this to be featured in Life magazine. And this house does still stand today and resembles very much the original design. Now, another Minnetonka architect who later became a Wayzata architect was Dick Hamill, who's pictured on the left there. And Dick Hamill partnered in 1953 with two partners named Kurt Green and Bruce Abramson. And they formed the company now known as HGA, or Hamill, Green, and Abramson. Dick Hamill later married Betty Jones, who many of us probably know. And Betty later became an architectural journalist, and we all know her for writing the book Legendary Homes of Lake Minnetonka, of which I've used several pictures from that book in this program tonight. Well, HGA really built an empire during the mid-century period in Minnesota, designing schools across our state. This is the Highland School. I believe this is in St. Paul, I think. But this is just one of many, many schools that HGA designed. They also designed basically entire college campuses, like the College of St. Benedict's in St. Joseph. This is the house in Wayzata that the Hamills ended up purchasing in, I think it was 1983 was when they purchased it. Dick Hamill did not design this house, but they bought it basically brand new and renovated it. But tragically, Dick Hamill passed away shortly after purchasing and renovating this house, which was designed by John Smith. But his wife Betty did live here for many, many years until relatively recently. Just about 5 years ago, she sold it. But this house does still exist today, and if you recognize it, it is located next to the lagoon by the Wayzata Beach. Now, HGA has gone on to become Minnesota's largest architectural firm, and they have offices all over the country. And if you've been in Minnesota for any time at all, whether it's a week or a lifetime, chances are you have been inside or have seen or visited an HGA building. Now, two local examples in Wayzata here that are relatively new buildings, just built in the past couple of years, are the Wayzata Sailing School and the Mill Street parking structure, both designed by HGA. And I think both of them actually won design awards for their designs. In fact, I know the Mill Street parking structure did receive some awards because it made something that would normally be an eyesore into something rather appealing. So moving on now to kind of the last architect of the box period was Ralph Rapson, who was kind of a rock star architect for Minnesota of sorts. And Ralph Rapson he was originally from Michigan, but came to Minnesota in 1954 to become the Dean of Architecture at the U of M. Now, he was known for colorful, boxy structures, and he was also known for playing a lot with the negative and positive space in his designs. You can even see that in the drawings on the right there. In 1963, he was commissioned by Philip Pillsbury II and his wife Eleanor to design a home for them in the Ferndale neighborhood of Wayzata, on Wayzata Bay. And this indeed became Ralph Rapson's largest residential commission or single-family home that he ever designed in Minnesota. So this was the Philip and Eleanor Pillsbury house on Ferndale, built in 1963. And this was basically located next to or adjacent to where Bill Cooper ended up building his house back in the 90s. This house was demolished, unfortunately, back in 1997, I believe, or thereabouts. But this house was named Dunbarton, and it was actually the third house on this property or in this locale to be called Dunbarton. And that name Dunbarton comes from the town or the village in New Hampshire where some of the Pillsburys originally came from way back when. Here's a closer up shot, or a couple closer up shots of the Philip and Eleanor Pillsbury house. And, fun fact about this house is that it apparently had a sauna somewhere, although I don't know where. So here's the inside of the house, dining room on the left and living room on the right. And just look at that stunning ceiling there. Again, that's Rapson playing a lot with negative and positive space there. I'm just really fascinated by that ceiling. But according to Philip Pillsbury, the third, this project was basically the perfect marriage of architect and client, and that would be between Ralph Rapson and Eleanor Pillsbury. It was basically Eleanor who was basically calling the shots on the project, and it was kind of their shared vision between Rapson and Eleanor Pillsbury that came to realize this house as it was. Here's another shot of one of the living areas. This is a beautifully composed picture. As I said, this house was unfortunately demolished in 1997. They did consider moving it, but unfortunately that could not be done for a number of reasons. It wasn't feasible, and on top of it, the building was designed specifically for this site, and it just basically would not work at any other location. So it unfortunately could not be saved. Ralph Rapson also had some other projects in Wayzata, although I don't believe any others were actually built. This was a Knutson Construction Company housing project that was proposed in 1970 that they had Ralph Rapson design. Now, I know it's kind of difficult to see where this would have been, but this would have been located right at the site of Wheatston Elementary School, and of course this was not built, but it would have looked very different today. We would have had some tall buildings at the top of the hill, and a large number of condos and apartment buildings. Wheatston, of course, was demolished in the 1890s and replaced with townhomes, but nothing like this that was proposed. Also, in the same year, Rapson had some fun with a kind of a master plan for Wayzata. And this is a drawing or a rendering of his looking from Wayzata Bay, looking towards downtown Wayzata. And it was kind of in his imagination what the ideal Wayzata would have looked like. You can see a lot of modern buildings would have been added in his utopia Wayzata, but note down here, depot still exists. So he never wanted to tear down the depot, so that's a good thing. So then in the late 1960s, we enter kind of the late stage period of modernism. And in the 1960s, the box type of architecture slowly goes out of fashion, and this era of so-called high kitsch begins. Over in Philadelphia, there's a group of architects called the Philadelphia School. That was a ring kind of led by a prominent architect named Louis Sullivan. And this school of architecture, the Philadelphia School, really started to place emphasis on reinterpreting historical forms rather than completely ignoring history. So this was kind of an ironic twist to modernism, because the whole point of modernism was to eschew history, but they kind of came to grips with reality and decided that you could not ignore history, but you could reinterpret it and change it for modern needs. Then in 1966, Robert Venturi, who was an architect who was part of the Philadelphia School, famously declared in defiance of Mies van der Rohe that less is a bore. And that was in direct defiance of the quote that less is more, God is in the detail. Robert Venturi took a total opposite approach, declared less is a bore, and that was kind of the seed on which postmodernism was planted. So I'll talk about a couple of the homes from this late stage modern period that were built in our area. And the first one is called Dragon Peak, which is located over in Orono off of Fox Road. This is located off of Tanager Bay or Tanager Lake, and it still exists today, actually. But this house was built in 1966 by the Gregory family. That would be William Gregory and his wife, Stanley Brooks, both old Minnesota, old Wayzata people. And they hired an architect, a Philadelphia school architect, named I.W. Colburn, to design this house. Now, this house was based on the design of a Scottish castle, but it's a modern interpretation of a Scottish castle. So it's really, this is when things really started to get weird, and as I continue to show photos here, you'll see why. Here's a closer up shot of Dragon Peak. And here's what the front courtyard kind of looked like, or the view from the front courtyard. And the landscapes, I should mention, for Dragon Peak were designed by a revered landscape architect during the time named Dan Kiley. This is a couple interior photos of Dragon Peak. And you can see it was very colorful in that photo on the right. And again, this is when things started to get weird, as did the whole country in general. Started to get kind of weird in the late 60s, and architecture followed suit there. But this house was named by the House and Garden magazine as the House of the Year in 1968. So that was a big accolade that this house received. It was also featured in the book The Face of Minneapolis, and also in the late 1960s. If you have that book in your collection, there is a photo on the left is actually from that book. Now, this house was totally restored in 2017, which was just great, and it does still stand today. And it definitely is one of the most unique houses in our area. Well, the final home that I'll be speaking to you about tonight is the Dayton Burnett House, which was located in Ferndale on Wayzata Bay. Now, this house was built by Kenneth and Judy Dayton in 1970, and they're from the Dayton Hudson and later Target company. Basically, we're part of the company when it transformed into being primarily Target. And they had earlier on purchased this land with a colonial revival mansion, or a house that was located on this property. But they were telling me about some stories that they were spooked by the house and had a couple of spooky incidents, let's say. So they were in the mood for a new house and decided to replace it with a bold, new, and modern home. So they started an international search for an architect, and they interviewed everyone from Philip Johnson, who I talked about earlier, who had designed the Davis House in Orono back in 1954. And they interviewed a lot of other architects as well. But they ended up settling on a relatively unknown architect named Romualdo Gurgala, who is pictured on the left there. Romualdo Gurgala was yet another Philadelphia school architect who was originally from Italy, but by this point had relocated to the United States. At this time, when the Daytons chose him as their architect, he really was basically an unknown, and his only project that had any acclaim to it at that time was the visitor center at the Wright Brothers Memorial in North Carolina. But they took a risk and decided to go with him. And he submitted this sketch, and this was the sketch that started it all, basically, or so I surmise. This was just a satellite image that I took of the house, or that I took a screenshot of before the house was torn down. But as you can see, this gives you an idea of kind of how the spaces were organized in the house. There was a central cube in the middle, and that central cube was where the living room was, and everything else kind of sprang off of that, like octopus arms. So here's what the house looked like from looking from the north side of the house. And it was painted white, obviously, very modern looking, but it was constructed out of wood. I believe this is all cedar. So it was natural products. The proportions, very Philadelphia school. As I mentioned earlier, the Philadelphia school looked back to historical precedent to reinterpret for modern things. And the proportions of this building very much fall in line with the classical ratios, which is basically 5 to 8, also known as the phi ratio. And I'm judging that based on the location of the tower. So that's very the average person wouldn't perhaps notice that, but it was very intentional on the part of Gergela. The landscapes of this house were also designed by Dan Kiley, who, as I mentioned, had also designed the landscapes at Dragon Peak in Orono just a few years before. And the landscape, probably the most interesting feature of the landscape of this property, is that it incorporated an ancient mound from the woodland period, and that mound has been dated to be about 2,000 years old. So this this property is just strikingly remarkable for spanning the whole course of human history, from ancient mounds to the most modern of modern structures. Here's another view of the house. This is looking at the where the front door is. It's kind of hidden. The front door would be located right below the chimney here. Note the shapes of the house here. You can see that the forms are very, they're almost like independent shapes, all springing off of the central cube. And this is basically what we would call deconstructivism later on, which was an early type of postmodernism. So this house was really represented kind of the end of the modern movement. It was kind of right on the edge of modern and postmodern architecture. And symbolically, I think it kind of was representative of that, with everything, a cube in the middle, going back to the box period, and everything else, all the crazy shapes, kind of extending off of that very simple cube in a more postmodern fashion. So here's what the middle of the house looked like. This was the living room, which was inside of the cube in the middle. And everything in the house basically centered around this room. And you can see the artwork that the Daytons had displayed in the house. This house was very much designed to display art. And this is what this room looked like most recently. The Burnett's owned it, and they, again, had an art collection and displayed it prominently in this house. Now, Romualdo Gergela, the architect of this house, after designing it in 1970, went on to have a long and successful career. This house helped build his profile and made him somewhat more of a famous architect, although he did other very prominent projects that made him very famous. He ended up moving to Australia and designed the Australian Parliament building, probably his most famous building. But this house was still, even though less famous, was still included in publications as being one of the most influential houses designed in the United States. Unfortunately, the Dayton Burnett house was demolished in 2016, and ironically, big twist of fate or irony, I don't know which one, but Romualdo Gergela, the architect, actually died on the same day that the house was torn down, or within a day or two of the demolition. So the timing could not have been crazier than that. And also, if this house, that was in 2016 when it was demolished, at that time it was 46 years old. If it had lived 4 more years to 2020, this house could have fit the legal description to be considered historic. The legal definition of historic it rolls to 50 years or older. So it theoretically could have been considered historic if it had lived just 4 more years. And by extension, the entire modernist movement can now basically be considered historic. So that was the last house of the modern movement that I'm talking about. So that's basically where the theme ends here. But just briefly, I'll mention here postmodernism, because that's where we went after modernism. And we had Frank Gehry up at the top here is kind of like the father of American postmodernism. He designed the Winton Guest House here in Orono, next to the Davis House in the 80s. We also have the Carlson Towers, were very the epitome of postmodernism. And down on the bottom here, we have James Dayton, who's a member of the Dayton family, and was a local architect here who did many projects in our area, including the addition to the Highcroft School, part of the Blake campus here in Wayzata, also the Minnetonka Center for the Arts. Now, all of this is postmodern, so we started getting a lot more into things that were much more about standalone shapes coming together to compose a whole structure. And there's a lot of irony. A word that's associated with postmodernism a lot is irony. So where are we now in regard to contemporary architecture? I mentioned a man named Alvar Aalto earlier on in the program, who was a Finnish architect who led the Northern Modernists in Europe, in Scandinavia, during the 1930s and the mid-century period. And basically, the Northern Modernists were very modern in nature, but instead of using steel and concrete and those types of materials, they used a lot of wood and a lot of glass. And Alvar Aalto had this quote that really encapsulated what his Northern Modernist philosophy was. And it says, "Form must have a content, and that content must be linked with nature." So here are some works by Alvar Aalto. These would have been from, I think, mostly the 1930s here. It's still strikingly modern. And I'll go to the next slide here. So let this image sear in your head, because the next image is almost a mirror image of some of this. So here we have David Selmela. He is one of Minnesota's prominent architects based in Duluth, but he has done a few buildings in our area around Lake Minnetonka and Wayzata as well. But I'll go back and forth between the two. You can really see it's like a mirror image almost. So clearly a lot of inspiration from Alvar Aalto and the Northern Modernists. And David Selmela himself is of Finnish heritage, just like Aalto, so that kind of makes sense there. But it's also this idea of regionalism that has really taken place in architecture in the United States, using local materials and celebrating kind of the heritage of the area. And in Minnesota, I suppose the idea is Scandinavian heritage that is being celebrated through our contemporary architecture. Another prominent architect around today is Julie Snow. And Julie Snow is a self-described Northern Modernist, also heavily influenced by Alvar Aalto. And Julie Snow actually came to Minnesota from Colorado originally to work for HGA, Dick Hamel's company. And that's where she got a lot of her training, and she has since gone on to become a very successful architect in Minnesota, and has designed several buildings in our area, some just masterpieces of houses on Lake Minnetonka, pictured on the right here. And also recently, one of her most recent projects, her firm recently just did the redesign of Lake Street in downtown Wayzata. And then finally, final person that I'll mention is Charles Stinson, who is based in Deep Haven. And he's another locally prominent architect who has designed many homes around the lake. But he takes inspiration from a little bit from Alvar Aalto, but also a lot from the boxy style of architecture from the mid-century period. And Stinson himself was a protege of Ralph Rapson, so that kind of makes sense there. So the last building I want to sum everything up in is the Wayzata Library, which is actually where we're hosting this program from tonight. We are located in the Wayzata Historical Society archives inside the Wayzata Library right now. And this building really encapsulates several of the design philosophies and styles that I talked about earlier in the program. So this building, the Wayzata Library, which was designed by the firm of Collin and Hanson in 2003, kind of has a little bit of influence from a little bit of the Frank Lloyd Wright and Prairie style influence, a little bit of the box influence, a little bit Alvar Aalto influence, and also a little bit of postmodernism as well. So it's kind of amalgamation of styles that has really come to define architecture today. And with that, I think we can open it up for questions. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. If you want to stick around, we'll take some questions here. And if you want, you can continue to ask questions up at the top right corner here. But I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And also want to thank the people who helped me once again. Also, I want to give a shout out to the group Dakamomo USMN, which is the local chapter of the group that preserves the modern movement or documents the modern movement in the United States. Once again, thank you, and we'll go over some questions here, so feel free to stick around.
Aaron, can I plug Docomomo one more time for you?
Oh, sure. Hi, that sounds like Bobak.
Yeah. Hi, this is Bobak Nairi. Aaron and I have worked together before, both with Docomomo and here. But if you're interested in modernism, we cover the whole state. But it was fascinating to look at this stuff. I mean, that Lacaze house in Woodland came up the other day only because his studio in New York City went up for sale for $15 million. Because it's New York City. But still, it was interesting. But it gives you also sort of an idea of the pull he had. And the fact that this random house in Woodland exists, which is far away from all the others he developed, was absolutely fascinating. And then there were a couple of other Rapson houses that deserve some mention. They're a little bit, not on the lake of Minnetonka. There's the Meach House up in Gleason Lake, which actually just sold in the last year.
Located
it was in great condition.
Burl Oaks, for the locals, it's in Burl Oaks.
Yeah, it's sort of on the northern end of Gleason Lake. It used to be on a larger property that was then subdivided for the neighborhood that surrounds it. The last owner was very sympathetic towards it. It was a Brazilian gentleman, and Brazil has a very famous history of modernism with Oscar Niemeyer and all that. And then also Long Lake has a couple of others. I.W. Colburn, who, funny enough, is known for his brutalist works. If you go to the University of Chicago, depending on your position, the most intriguing or horrific buildings, depending on where you feel on brutalism, were him. So Dragon's Peak was also kind of striking to watch him. And by the way, I know that's where Aaron grabbed those pictures. In his monograph, is the book that really gets into his works. That is one of the featured houses. That is, and structures is Dragon's Peak. But he also did another one for Donald and Lucy Dayton. Also, it's right on the north end of Lake. And not far from it is also Long Shadows, another Rapson house that he did by request of the owner to kind of bring in a bit of Japanese influence into the design. And had a very sympathetic addition done to it by the late Jim Dayton. But I just wanted to mention those as well. I thought this was an excellent presentation, and it was a pleasure to help with it. But there's a lot of really intriguing design in the metro, and the lakes especially.
Didn't Ralph Rapson also do the Dixon House on Maxwell Bay?
Bob, do you know?
That's a great question. Let me double check on that. We have this database, a registry that we've created, and it's an interactive map for the public. It's just minnesotamodernmap.com. I created that link just to go to that site. But I am unfamiliar, but it could be, and I apologize for that. There were also a couple of other homes in the area. There was one in Orono that unfortunately was demolished, and there was there is an extant. Oh wait, there is one in Excelsior that's quite well known. Well, that was a later work by him. The Wire Strampy House. That's kind of at on Lakeview. On Deep Haven, right. So which one's Maxwell Bay? This is where my transplant comes in.
Fox Street. And it's
right.
Very black cubic house, and I think that was Ralph Rapson.
I apologize, I'm unaware, but I would love to look more into it. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Are you talking about the one that's at the very end?
It's just before you get to where Kevin Garnett.
Okay. Because I knew the Kevin Garnett house. That I knew wasn't here. That's why I was kind of like, are we talking about the Kevin Garnett house?
No.
But by the way, before we leave that area, opposite side of that shore is a very interesting neighborhood called Partonwood, which used John Howe for most of the houses. Now, if you know who John Howe was, he was the hand of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was his drafter for many, many years. We screened a documentary about him with Docomomo last year, but he decided to settle in the Twin Cities. So there's quite a few homes by him in the area that sort of very strongly emulate the Frank Lloyd Wright style. And Partonwood is a particularly interesting neighborhood because several of those houses he designed, rather than them kind of being spread out here and there. I know that Bette Hamill's excellent book profiled one of them, the Goodale. I think it was the good. I apologize. It's one of the names and then never pronouncing them, which is ironic because my name is one where you scared trying to pronounce it.
That's for sure.
Yeah, but that house is also one. But I apologize for not being aware of the house you're speaking of, because I love hearing things like that because it gives me something to look more into.
Well, and one minor correction on the talk is it's Jurgala, not Gurgala, with a soft G.
Pardon my Italian.
No problem.
I see Nancy here wants to know where the cabin was where Frank Lloyd Wright was arrested. That was in Tonka Bay, right on where Wildhurst Road is. It's kind of right where Wildhurst Road comes to an intersection. Would have been right next to that intersection in the Wildhurst neighborhood of Tonka Bay. Where that is. The cabin is no longer there.
Well, thank you, Aaron. That was really well done. I appreciate it. And look forward. I was hoping to get my mom on, but the person helping her with the computer wasn't computer savvy, and we'll get her to watch a redo.
Great. Yeah. You can always watch the recordings.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
One last question. Tell me again, you mentioned Don Husted's house?
Yep. So Don Husted's house is located, it still stands today, and it's kind of in the neighborhood of Minnetonka, kind of right behind Snuffy's Malt Shop.
So just north of Bennett Park there?
It's kind of, like north and
east of Bennett Park.
So yeah, it's
right
in that area.
Oh, cool. Okay. All right, great.
Yeah. I keep all these addresses, not in memory. I have my map next to me, but it looks gorgeous, and especially when the trees don't have leaves, you can get a very nice look at it from a distance. It has kind of a classic bridge entryway from like the driveway, like crossing to the. He really did a good job of integrating the site and kind of the walkout lower level when he designed it.
I lived in one of his homes and I had seen the whole Life magazine presentation, but I didn't know where it was. That's so cool. I'm going to go look at it. Excellent. Enjoyed the presentation very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you,
Signing
everyone.
off. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for your questions and comments, and thank you for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at the next program. That'll be. So take care.